Good afternoon. My name is Ken Vandenungen. I'm the Director of Business Development for RBC Agriculture and Commercial Financial Services in Lethbridge. If you haven't already, please stop by our booth at some point during the conference. If you're an Agronomy Smart subscriber, we might have a 20-ounce Hydro Flask coffee tumbler for you. RBC is a proud smart partner of the Farming Smarter program and is delighted to introduce our next speaker. Ryan Barrett is the Research and Agronomy Specialist with the Prince Edward Island Potato Board in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. In this role, he coordinates local and national research projects with numerous partners, as well as conducting on-farm research trials with a number of PEI potato growers. Ryan graduated with a Bachelor's of Science from the Dalhousie Faculty of Agriculture in 2002 and a Master's of Science from the University of Guelph in 2004. He has worked with the PEI Potato Board since 2012 after previously working in the purebred dairy cattle industry. He continues to be involved in his family's dairy farm in Belmont, Lot 16, breeding registered milking shorthorns. Ryan also serves as Secretary Manager of the Canadian Milking Shorthorn Society. Ryan is a professional agrologist and serves as the Vice President of the PEI Institute of Agrologists. He is also a certified crop advisor for the Atlantic Provinces and serves on the Board of Directors for the Potato Association of America, the Prince Edward Island 4-H Council, and the Eastern Canadian Oilseeds Development Association. Please join me in welcoming Ryan to the stage.
Hi, everybody. We'll try and keep this upbeat, considering we're 4 o'clock and I'm keeping you away from supper. You've been kind enough to invite some devil from the east to come and talk to you about agriculture, so I'll try and make sure it's as accessible as possible. I work, as was just mentioned, I work with the potato growers in PEI. We've done a lot of work the last number of years on cover crops, along with lots of other grower-initiated work. Everything I talk to you today is, for the most part, on-farm research with growers, directed by growers, and that's very much our model of trying to do grower-directed and grower-led research. So, for a number of years, one of the highest priority areas for research in PEI has been around improving soil health, improving organic matter, and sustainable land management. We're an island with fairly erodible soils, vulnerable to wind and water erosion, sandy loam soils. It's a rain-fed system, so very much unlike what you guys have here in the Lethbridge and Tabor area. You know, only about 10% of our acreage is irrigated, so we're very much reliant on keeping that rain and keeping that water in the soil, so increasing organic matters to help do that. And we know that if we continue to erode and continue to degrade our soils, that both our short-term and our long-term profitability is going to be impaired. So, you know, to help look after that, one of the tools we can look at is cover crops, amongst lots of other things. There's many aspects to what different people define as regenerative or sustainable agriculture, and that may be different depending on where you farm too. So what we do in PEI may be different than what you're doing here in Alberta. But what we really wanted to do as part of PEI was home to the first Living Labs program in Canada, and part of that was trying to look at best management practices that were associated with improving soil organic matter and soil health and water quality, but also addressing some short-term return on investment. And so we were looking at, can we track things like yield improvements, reduced pressure from soil-borne diseases, those sorts of things. My qualifying statement, I put this in last night. My research is based on work in PEI, and there's a lot of differences between growing potatoes or growing anything in PEI versus growing things here. So my goal is simply to share what we're doing in PEI, and if there's something from that that you think might be worth following up on here, that's great. But I'm not as my British friends say, I'm not going to teach your grandmother to suck eggs. So I'm not up here to tell you how to do things. So it's just something that may resonate with you and start the conversation. Just a little bit about agriculture in Prince Edward Island. Lots of people ask me about that at lunch and at the tables. So we very much have a sandy loam soil. We get about 43 inches of annual rainfall or precipitation a year, so that's a considerable amount more than you get here. Sometimes we get 100 mils in a day in some of these big rainstorms. But generally we get somewhere about 90 to 100 mils a month is more or less where we're at. We grow about 85,000 acres of potatoes, so we are the largest acreage province of potatoes in Canada. Alberta beat us on the tonnage this year, but we are still the biggest acreage of potatoes in Canada. Other major crops, barley, wheat, soybeans, corn's on the upswing, soybeans probably on the down. We grow a lot of forages in rotation with potatoes. Wild blueberries that's a perennial crop, but it's increasing in acreage as well. We have a fairly strong dairy industry, but our hog and beef industries declined a lot. We don't have a hog processing plant. We do have a beef processing plant, but our cattle herd probably declined by half after BSE. Our government's trying really hard to get it back on the upswing, but that's kind of where we're at. A lot of the conversation I had at lunch and with some of the folks that we were talking to is, you know, what else you grow and why don't you grow this and why don't you grow that? And a lot of it comes down to we're a long distance away from the population, we're a long distance away from the market. And on basic commodities, if you're just going on, you know, tons of wheat and tons of barley and tons of pulses, we lose half the profit shipping it to you. So that's a lot of the issue with growing things at PEI. So we try and focus on high value products like potatoes and dairy, and also value added. So we have a lot of specialty crop and fruit crop and specialty vegetable and that sort of stuff. Most of our potatoes are in a 3-year rotation, so about one less than here. I think most potatoes in Alberta are on a 4-year rotation. Generally, that rotation, there's no one rotation for everybody, but generally it's potatoes followed by a cereal crop. And that cereal crop may or may not be underseeded with a forage that then is grown out for a full year after that. There are lots of people not doing that now, and they may be doing either an annual cover in that 3rd year. They may be doing another cash crop. There are very few potato acres in PEI that have a cash crop in them every year. Very few. The year before potatoes, I would say about 80% of our potato acres, the year before potatoes do not have a cash crop in them. They may have a hay crop or forage crop where they take a crop alfalfa off or something like that, and there's some cash flow, but it's primarily grown for soil improving practices, nitrogen fixation, those sorts of things. So, under our Living Lab Atlantic project, I led 3 projects. There was a larger initiative with lots of other projects in it as well, but 3 things in particular I was looking at. The first 2 are looking at fall seeded cover crops, so after harvest or before potatoes the next year. Earlier today there was talk about it as kind of almost like a fall nurse crop. We call it a fall cover before potatoes. So we did before potatoes, we did covers after potato harvest, and then we were also looking at sort of full season covers. So as I said, that year before potatoes, and trying to optimize that. What are the best crops that work for us? What's the dynamics of how they fit into rotations? So why fall cover crops? There's nothing new here. Number 1 rule for fall cover crops is to prevent soil erosion. If you can prevent your soil from eroding, you're ahead of the game. That's the number 1 reason to use a cover crop, and everything else is gravy. But we're also looking at, you know, fall cover crops, can they help reduce nitrogen losses? PEI with our high precipitation rate and our sandy soil, lots of opportunity for nitrate leaching, so the covers can help carry nitrates over to the next year. We know more and more from research that we build soil organic matter not through trash, not through residue as much as we do from growing roots and living roots and feeding the soil microbes. So that's a big part of having the field green as much as possible. Of course, then we can also look at the roles of covers for weed suppression, disease suppression, as was just talked about, or possibly the other way, disease proliferation. And then we also wanted to look at, is there an opportunity for a yield improvement after cover crops in a PEI context? So we wanted to look at that as well. There's a photo from one of the trial fields. On the left-hand side is where there was just there was just barley planted the fall before. It never got that big, but it got big enough to grow some roots and hold some soil and do something, and most of it winter killed, but it kept the soil in place. And on the right side in our check, there's all kinds of channels and all kinds of rutting and not good. So that's an example in PEI where we get so much rain, especially we get a lot of rain in November, we get a lot of rain in April. It can lead to a lot of that sort of channeling and gullying, and we don't want that. So one thing we used in a couple of our projects, we used these, can't even remember what I called them, splash pans, I guess, where we put those in the soil and compared where we had them in a cover versus a non-cover. And they basically they're a kind of an erosion modeling metric, but it's trying to measure how much soil is displaced by rainfall from like when the rain hits the surface of the soil and moves it into this trough in the splash pan. And we saw about a 50% reduction in the soil that accumulated in the splash pans when we had a cover versus no cover. Now, you may say, okay, well here in southern Alberta where you don't get a lot of rain in the fall, maybe that's not as big of a deal. But I think there's also, if soil particle is susceptible to be moved by moisture, for the energy of moisture hitting the ground, it's also susceptible to be lost through wind, right? So there is energy there, and I think it is a good proxy for trying to look at erosion. It's very hard to measure erosion in a scientific way on a field scale. So this is just one little easy, quick, cheap thing. You could do a few of these splash pans up at a metal manufacturer for pretty cheap. I can send you the specs if you want. It did a pretty good job of kind of measuring where we were on that. So that's late January this past year. I was just driving by one of the growers' farms, and so it was a potato field that had been harvested and seeded with fall rye, and they spun the fall rye on ahead of the digger, so then the digger kind of incorporates the seed as you're going along and save it pass. And it's not huge, but it's green, and it's holding soil, and there's nothing blowing off that, and all the snow around it wasn't red. As you know, in PEI, all our soil's red. So it's not, it was keeping soil in place and is doing what it's supposed to do. And then in the spring, yes, they'll likely have to spray that off because it'll come pretty fast in the spring, but it is doing what it's supposed to be doing. I talked about nitrogen losses there before, so again, we have a lot of fields that the year before potatoes are in a legume hay, so clover or alfalfa is getting really popular, but maybe even just in other types of legumes and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of potential for this nitrate leaching. And also increasingly important is nitrous oxide emissions, right? Because nitrous oxide, 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and can be lost from in times of excess nitrogen in the soil. So what we're looking at is, again, what was the role of the cover crop in mitigating some of that nitrogen loss? And we saw where we had the covers before potatoes, we had about a 40% reduction in the nitrates in the top layer of soil. So that was nitrates that are being taken up by the crop and being carried over to next year. A little less in the covers after potatoes because the covers just don't get as big. They don't have as much time to get as big. As I mentioned before, when it comes to building soil carbon, the majority of our soil carbon comes from root exudates, the necromass, as some people call it, of microbial biomass, dead bacteria and fungi that gets cycled and turned into more stable organic matter. And it's not so much from the above ground residue. Above ground residue is great, and leaving it on there is great, but there's a lot more building of organic matter by having something green in the field as long as possible, by having living roots as long as possible. And not only is that good for soil erosion, and the soil you erode is also the soil that's the highest in organic matter, so you're keeping that in the field, but also it's possible to, you're recycling more nutrients, you're building more soil carbon with those roots. So if we can look at our shoulder seasons and find another 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months of green, even if it's just a little green, it's better than nothing. We looked at weed suppression in some of our trials. Some trials we just didn't see much of a difference. Some trials we saw a fairly stark difference. This trial, everything on the left was daikon radish or tillage radish after wheat the year before. The stuff that's a bit green on the right was our check, which was just the wheat stubble that was worked but no cover crop. And you can see right to the line a pretty definite difference in carryover weeds that next spring. And we saw that in a few different fields. We've generally seen mustard and radish, if planted early enough, will outcompete weeds and suppress weeds going into the next year. And then, fall rye, we know, has alleliopathic abilities to actually physically suppress weeds through its root exudates. We've seen some evidence that maybe some of that in buckwheat as well. So there are some growers, especially some of our fresh market growers, that are really liking that in terms of some of that early season weed suppression. Now, the question of increasing yields. Our last presenter just talked about in the United States, yield reductions from using covers in the Midwest in corn and soybean rotations. There has been some work done in Ontario. Dr. Laura Van Erd with Ridgetown College and University of Guelph, looking at a field tomato rotation with corn and wheat and other crops, and they were actually able to see some yield improvements with the use of fall covers ahead of vegetable crops. Likewise, we did some work and talked to some agronomists over in the UK, growing systems somewhat similar to what we would have in PEI, and they also saw generally an increasing trend on yield where they used a fall cover instead of a fall cover. So we wanted to look at, could we replicate that in PEI? What degree of it did we see? And what we saw is that basically over about 20 trials, 20 grower trials or so over about 3 or 4 years, we saw about a 3,200 weight yield improvement where we had a cover versus no cover. And that's about a 10-11% yield improvement. Why? I would say part of it is probably nitrogen carryover. Part of it is probably temperature differences in the soil. It's probably not increase in organic matter, because you can't build organic matter that fast. But I think there's probably a bunch of reasons. Maybe it's just improved nutrient cycling and energizing that microbial biomass. I'm not sure. But what we did see is that with this vegetable crop, with potatoes, we did see consistently this increase. So this is the average over about 20 trials, but the win rate on it was about 85%. So we only had a couple of fields where it wasn't, and the reasons why was they didn't get them killed early enough. They didn't winter kill, and they didn't get them killed early enough in the spring, and then they tied up nitrogen. So that can be an issue, but with management, it can be managed as well. So as I said, we saw that's the difference we saw historically. Before the last, especially 5 to 10 years. A lot of PEI fields, they'd be in alfalfa or clover or something for the year, and then they might get sprayed with Roundup in the fall, they might not, but they would usually not get plowed until late October, early November, and then sit bare all winter. And that's not good for erosion. It's also not good for really capitalizing on the nutrient release, the nitrogen release from those legumes either, because it sort of delays that nitrogen release until almost too late the next year. So by moving more of this tillage ahead of potatoes up to late August, early September, we got more time to get a cover on. We're seeing some of this impact on potato yields. We're terminating legumes earlier, which hopefully returns more of that nitrogen release earlier in the year to next year when we need it. And we're also just operationally, we're getting some field work done at a time when growers are a little less busy. So in PEI, growers are a little less busy in late August, early September than they are in October, November. So I think, operationally it helps as well. So there's lots of fall cover crop options. How do we choose? There's no one recipe for everyone. There's no one recipe for every farm. A lot of it comes down to where are you farming? On Alberta, PEI, whatever. What crop am I following? What crop am I planting into next? Your establishment window, I know that your establishment window is different than my establishment window. We can usually get fall rye to establish until mid-October in PEI. That might be a little more problematic here. What equipment do you have? Starting out simple, just working with what you've got, and then eventually scaling up to what you can do. And seed and establishment cost is big too. There's a lot of people who come and tell you and say, oh, there's this amazing cover crop and blah, 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 blah. And between seed and establishment costs, you're into $100 an acre. And I'm here to say that you don't need to spend $100 an acre to plant a cover crop. So these are PEI timelines. They may need to be phase shifted a little bit for you guys in some cases, but basically I put them into three main categories. Our mid-August to mid-September, that's when we've got people doing oilseed and daikon radish. We have a lot of growers now. I'd say more than 50% of our growers use vertical tillage in the fall before potatoes, like a Lemken, Karat, or Potager Synchro, or something like that, Vaterstedt. And then they mount the seed box right on it. And so that way they can do the cover crop and the tillage all in one pass, saving some time, saving some cost. And radish, you're only putting on 10 pounds an acre, 12 pounds an acre, so you're not constantly filling that box all the time, so it works pretty well. Same with the mustard. Lots of opportunity for your spring cereals like your barley and the oats. The oats are great for a fall cover, especially if you want it to winter kill ahead of spuds. Winter canola is a cash crop. You guys are more familiar with that than we are. There's not too much canola grown in PEI. Winter wheat, winter barley. We tried some work with winter barley. Basically, most of our trial work was too late. It looked amazing in the fall. Thought we were going to have nobody's going to plant winter wheat ever again. This is the best thing ever. And then it all crapped the bed in the spring. So, I think I harvested 1 out of 8 trials with the winter barley. So it may be we just have to plant it earlier, or maybe we need to look at some other varieties or something. Oats and peas, got some growers doing that maybe as a grazing option. Kale, other mixes of brassicas and cereals. There's a lot more options the earlier you go. We usually find that on the radish and the mustard, by about the, 8th to 10th of September, that's probably about as late as you want to go to get a good establishment. Probably earlier here. Winter peas, a few people using that often in a mix again with like oats or something like that. But at this time, your heavy lifting is your spring cereals and your winter cereals. We have an increasing amount of winter wheat grown in PEI, particularly after potatoes. The early season potatoes like your seed acres, chip acres, early season to the plant French fry acres. A lot of those acres are now getting winter wheat because then you have a cover, but you're also, of course, growing something out the next year that you're going to make money on. We don't grow too much, as I said, winter barley, winter triticale. Fall rye is liked by some people. We got some guys plant corner to corner every acre with fall rye after spuds. Other people don't like it because they got to manage it. They got to kill it out the next year, and we don't really have a lot of market for rye in PEI. And then after about mid-October, you basically have 2 options. Winter wheat, and that if you're in the eastern PEI, you can get away with it a little later than in sort of western PEI. And then your fall rye. And we can get fall rye to establish pretty consistently up till about the middle of October. It's not going to get really big, but with our winters in PEI, it'll usually overwinter. We do get some cold in PEI, but we'll get a week of -20, and then the rest of the winter is more like -5, -7, 0, that sort of thing. We didn't have snow until after Christmas this year, and then we got 100 centimeters of snow the weekend before last. So it comes and goes in big bunches. So making the fall cover crop choice, making the right fall cover crop choice, there's lots that goes into that. I talked about fall rye. You've got some more options with fall rye. That's a photo there from my home farm. So my family is a dairy farm, and 2020 was a drought year at home, and we're basically knew by the end of May, 1st of June, that we're going to have troubles with with feed, and we just made the decision. We had some fall rye that went in after potatoes, and we said, we're going to bail that off. And we bailed that off at the first day of June before we planted corn, and that was our best corn yield of the year. And we got 4 bales of the acre of rye silage off of it. So there's some flexibility, there's some options, especially if you leave it till it's half mature. It's a little easier to kill once it goes reproductive. Rye ahead of corn or soybean, there's some options. Ahead of potatoes, the brassicas and your spring cereals normally winter kill. In PEI, I'd say about 90-95% of the time they winter kill. So you're not having to, kill it in the spring. One thing we did learn from our work, we did a number of trials with growers where, especially late, we went with higher levels of seeding rates on some of the covers just to say, because some growers were telling me they were putting on ridiculous amounts of seed because the theory was, oh, it's late, I need more seed because I need more stuff to germinate to try and get the same amount of green cover. And, you know, a guy's putting on 150 pounds an acre of oats and basically found that there was no difference between using more like 70 pounds an acre than double. So really we were able to tell the growers, save your seed costs, put on, you know, your 50 to 75 pounds an acre, and that will get you some cover, and you're not gonna gain a lot more by increasing the rate. So where does this fit in terms of adoption in PEI? We have been pretty good for a while on the use of covers after potatoes. We were already in the high 40%. This is a survey that we've been doing through the board of our own members for the last 5 years. And 2020, again, that's a drought year, so you see the numbers are dipped a little bit after potato harvest because we just had some issues with germination and people were a little late digging and that sort of thing. But we're consistently hovering around 50% on the covers after potatoes. To get that number higher, we need to have more potatoes dug before the 15th of October. We can consistently dig potatoes until Halloween in PEI because we don't get those hard frosts as early as you guys do. But we are also adopting more earlier season varieties, shorter season varieties, less russet Burbanks, varieties that mature 10 days earlier. So that gives us more of a window for cover crop adoption. What's really increased is this covers before potatoes. As I said, we used to have a lot of open fields in the years before potatoes, and now we're up over 60% of our fields ahead of potatoes have living green covers on them in the year before, and I think that's been a real benefit for us as an industry. Switching gears a little bit, as I said, to talk about more about the full season covers. I've been mostly talking about fall seeded covers before this. Again, the majority of our acres in PEI are preceded by a forage crop. Some of it is harvested, maybe once or twice. A lot of it's just mulched. I got growers that just, you know, they've got one guy all summer just running a chopper all year and he's just mowing down forages all year. That used to be a lot of double cut red clover, and then we've determined that double cut red clover is a host for verticillium, it's a host for common scab, it's a host for nematodes, it's a host for a few different things. So we've had a lot of people moving away from double cut red clover, moving to some annuals like your Sudan grasses and pearl millets and other things, a lot into alfalfa. And so, you know, lots of questions to me, what is the best choice? What should I be moving to? What are the impacts on the potato yield versus good or bad, and on management? So comparing some of these, what I'm going to call soil building crops, be they single species or mixtures, versus annual ryegrass, which we'd also had a lot of growers growing as a cover crop ahead of potatoes. We did see a statistically significant improvement in yield with those sort of crops instead of annual ryegrass. I think a lot of that is because mature annual ryegrass, if you leave it to be fairly mature, can tie up a lot of nitrogen the next year in terms of breaking down that high carbon amount. And it can also be a weed issue. Italian ryegrass is overwintering better in PEI all the time, and it can be a little bit more of a weed issue. So what we mostly compared was things like these warm season C4 grasses, so sorghum, Sudan grass, forage, pearl millet. Also looked at things like tillage and oilseed radish, sometimes mixes, 2 or 3 way mixes. But narrowing it down into sort of more things we saw in specific crops or specific comparisons. Root lesion nematodes is an issue in PEI. I don't know, it's too much of an issue here, maybe not. But again, we saw that those numbers were the highest following red clover, also high after corn. They were the lowest following the brassicas, the mustard, the radish, and after forage pearl millet. And we know that forage pearl millet is a non-host for root lesion nematodes. So people with severely compromised fields, like fields that are always dying early, fields that they have a report on that says I've got 10,000 nematodes per kilogram of soil, that's where they're going in with the pearl millet. It is a little more costly in terms of seed cost, but if you are able to lower the nematode numbers down by 40 or 50% in a year, it's got some value. We may need to see more sampling intensity and more years to really see some of that true effect of crops. Generally, our tillage frequency in our non-potato years is much higher than yours is here in Alberta. That is, we have more movement towards no-till or reduced till all the time. But I would think as we see more movement in that way, we'll see less soil disturbance and we will see more improvements in some of these soil health metrics. But really what we saw and what we've continued to see is that it isn't so much what we grow, it's more tillage frequency and how much biomass, how much of the cover crop that we're able to get established. So that comes down to timing, management, that sort of thing. You can have the fanciest mix in the world, but it's all about how well did your cover crop grow, how early did you get it in, and then how does that carry over to the next year. We have done some work on mustard as a biofumigant crop. I looked at it in our Living Labs work, and then I also did a separate 3-year study with our agronomy initiative with the board. We saw very inconsistent results on it, and I think the main reason for that is because, again, without irrigation, to incorporate mustard as a green manure, to get the best bang for your buck and get the maximum gas release from those glucosinolates turning into isothiocyanate gas, you need water. And so if you're putting it in the 1st of July in PEI, and that tends to be when it may actually be the driest, it's kind of a self-defeating process. So we really only saw a payback, it was only really worth doing on our worst fields that maybe were in a tight rotation or they'd grown Burbanks for 15 years or something. Those were maybe where we saw some benefit, but where they were growing maybe longer rotation or they had more vert-resistant varieties, we didn't see so much benefit. But maybe with more access to irrigation, you might see more results. We did some multi-year trials around comparing different legumes ahead of potatoes, and as well as a grass check. And we saw considerable improvement in yields following alfalfa compared to either red clover or ryegrass. And again, I think one of the big ones there is nitrogen fixation. We know that alfalfa probably fixes almost double the amount of nitrogen as red clover, but we also saw considerable improvements in compaction from the alfalfa. Those deep tap roots really helped with breaking up soil layers and breaking up compaction. Had a few people ask me today about wireworm suppression. PEI has kind of been the epicenter for wireworm in Canada for the last 10 years or so. And we've done a lot of work on it, a lot of research on it, because it was such an issue. And we have European wireworm species that are very resistant to just about everything. You can freeze them solid and they'll come back to life. So they are very hard to control. What we have found is that use of either brown mustard or buckwheat as a crop ahead of potatoes did decrease wireworm damage in the resultant crop by anywhere from 25 to 50%, depending on incorporation and management and that sort of thing. And what was interesting is that we actually saw similar levels of control, whether we incorporated it as a green manure or whether we just grew it, because the wireworm control is not through like a biofumigation as much as it is through they feed on the roots, and there's chemical compounds in the roots that interrupt mostly their molting cycles. Within mustards, it's the glucosinolates that we know about. That's a known mechanism, and we know that has an effect. But in the buckwheat, we didn't know why. We just knew that it worked, but we didn't know why. So Ag Canada did quite a bit of work in Charlottetown the last few years, and they were able to actually isolate what compounds are doing it. They're able to do a bunch of both greenhouse and pot work as well as field work, and they were able to show that in buckwheat, the wireworms were actually incentivized and they wanted to feed on the buckwheat. So they were attracted to feed on the buckwheat, they ate the buckwheat roots, and then whatever the chemical that's in those roots started to interrupt their molting cycles, and that's when we saw larger levels of death and reduced vigor in those wireworms. So we have a number of growers, particularly our fresh market growers, number of growers that grow, say, creamers for little potato or some of those, types of early table markets that are really, really vulnerable to wireworm damage. They're growing buckwheat in the spring, and then maybe mowing it off in the summer, and then maybe planting mustard after it, that sort of thing. Buckwheat, not a great fall cover option, unfortunately, especially if planted in later, because it is very susceptible to frost damage. So in PEI, we wouldn't plant it after probably the 1st of August in terms of getting that kind of management on it. One note I would say is we really didn't see any evidence in our work that ultra diverse mixes had any real benefit on either yields or soil health metrics. There's lots of different mixes, and there's lots of different studies and talks about diversity of cover crop mixes. We did grower trials. We did a trial with Ag Canada on a replicated, controlled multi-plot site over 3 or 4 years, and really, a single species or 2 or 3 species mix cover was as effective in terms of soil health metrics and yield as those ultra diverse mixes if they had the similar amount of biomass. So again, I think it's more about picking the crops that fit the rotation, fit your region, don't become a weed issue, don't require too much extra cost, aren't costing $100 an acre, don't multiply pests and diseases, aren't for what the key crops in your rotation are that aren't making things worse. And then if possible, as much as possible, make your cover make you money. So, winter cereals and winter oil seeds and that sort of stuff. So, I always, when I'm talking to growers and they're saying, what should I plant? I always say, well, what's your biggest problem? What's the biggest problem with that field? So if your biggest problem is compaction, I advise alfalfa, I advise tillage radish, Sudan grass, pearl millet. If it's wireworm, of course, it's more the mustard or the buckwheat. If it's nematodes, we're talking about millet and Sudan grass, radish and mustard to a degree. If you want to fix nitrogen, I want to cut my nitrogen bill and I want to, feed this crop a little bit more through my legume crop, then you've got different legumes to use. And if it's building soil organic matter, as I said, it's how do I grow the most biomass for the longest amount of the year? That's really the biggest thing. So it's how do I keep that ground as green as possible for as many months as I can, as many weeks as I can, with lots of biomass. So looking ahead, where are we going from now? We finished a One Living Labs project in early 2023. We're transitioning, we're into starting the 2nd year of our next Living Labs this crop season. Projects I'm doing, we're trying to dial in that nitrogen credit a little bit more. I got a lot of growers at home, like they factor in a nitrogen credit, but it's very fuzzy in terms of what it is and how much it is. And the numbers we're using, maybe they come from Ontario, maybe they come from Cornell, maybe they come from PEI 40 years ago. We're trying to kind of figure that all out. And then, and is that affected by termination date? Is that affected by the presence of a cover crop? Because does the cover crop carry nitrogen over to the next year? We kind of saw that from some previous research, but we want to quantify it. We're also looking at rotational grazing. I've got 4 or 5 farms that are looking at grazing in the year before potatoes. Again, we're growing a cover crop. Can we get more value out of that? So we're getting some manure back on the ground. We're grazing that ground in a rotational managed way. So I've got a few different farms working on that, and we've got checks versus our grazed. And then what are some of the cumulative effects of cover cropping and reduced tillage? We tried to look at this on a year in, year out, one cycle, and it was really hard to get through the data to see much of a trend, maybe some slight trends. But it's really hard. You can't really see organic matter building in a year. You need to see it over a couple of rotations. So that's why I've got a few farms where we're doing half the field cover crop all the time after every harvestable crop, and then no cover crop after every harvestable crop, and then over 5 years, do we see any difference in soil health metrics, on organic matter, that sort of stuff. So just to acknowledge, none of this the money has to come from somewhere. I work for the Prince of Rhode Island, the Potato Board, for the growers of PEI, and we have a 3-way funding program between Cavendish Farms, the growers, and our Provincial Department of Agriculture that fund a lot of these agronomy projects. And then through our Living Labs, of course, that was done through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And then we have our Living Lab partners, the East Prince and Agri-Environment Association. That's a group of 15 young farmers that wanted to do more research and wanted to do more on-farm research, and they're our provincial leads actually in managing living labs. So that's been a really good news story. Also working with some of our watershed groups. They're providing some of the manpower for doing some of the field work, so that's great. And then also working with Dalhousie University in Truro. So that's me. That's my contact information. I'll be around this evening. I'll be around tomorrow. I really appreciate the invitation to come out and talk to you. I like to try and get around to different parts of the country and different places that grow spuds and talk to growers and talk to agronomists, because there's always something I can learn and take back home, and then hopefully I can share a little bit of what we're doing too. So thank you for the invite, and if we have time for any questions, I'll...
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, we have time for a couple of questions. There's a microphone coming, Congressman.
Ryan, what are your measurements for soil health?
Measurements for soil health?
Yes, you talked about that. And
Yep.
What are they? Because I haven't seen a good definition anywhere.
Yep.
And I haven't seen any good measurements.
Everybody's got a
that-
different
that I
measurement
can
for soil
prove
health.
to anybody that it's worth something. I mean,
Yep.
I know organic carbon, but
Yep.
past that, what's your measurements and how do you validate them? Because how do they show soil health?
Sure. So our provincial Department of Agriculture runs a soil lab, and they do a soil health test that at the moment is free to all PEI producers in the testing phase, but they've been doing it now for about 5 years, and they're building a library of soil health measurements. Some of the major ones there is active carbon, aggregate stability, biological nitrogen availability, and soil respiration. Those are sort of the 4 major ones, along with organic matter. And then, of course, they're doing the soil constituent analysis, so your physical characteristics, pH, that sort of stuff. So there's the chemical, the biological, and the physical. They kind of put those all in. And then on top of that, when I'm doing a lot of these trials, I'm also doing measurements of things like verticillium and root lesion nematodes and some of those other pathogen issues, which are the major issues in PEI. So all of my living lab trials, we would do vert and nematode analysis with them as well. So we're trying to cover, biological, chemical, physical, and also pathogen as much as we can.
So, okay, and that's fine. I mean, I've heard most of those measurements before. How do they correlate to production?
Yep. So we're still kind of building that story a bit, but we're building a fairly significant database now of soil health measurements on fields, which we can then correlate to yields in fields. And then we can build that database, and hopefully through sort of using a big database, we can start looking at some of those trends. So right now, when people submit samples, they can kind of say whether it's a good field, bad field, medium field, that sort of thing. But we're also able to, if we can have those fields tested, then we can also layer on yield data and other data on it as well, and try and find those correlations. I wouldn't say, we're not there yet, but it's very much a work in progress. But I would say in PEI, in terms of building that database of soil health information, we're probably as far ahead as anybody. So we're really trying to build that.
Hi, Ryan. Just wondering if you could comment on potential impact of the cover crops before potatoes, potential impact on like the potato quality, potato uniformity. I've heard some resistance to pre-potato cover crops just because of concerns about impact on the crop. Just wondering if you had any comments or experience with that.
So as I said, our win rate, as I would call it, in terms of benefits on yields and quality the next year was about 80 to 85%. Where we did have an issue, it was usually wireworm related, or it was, as I said, a mature, improperly managed cover crop that then wasn't properly terminated. And so that led to some issues maybe with as volunteer weed issues the next year. But generally where people have been using winter self-terminating cover crops that winter kill, we really have not seen any issues, any detriment to the crop, and if anything, we've mostly seen the other way. Any other questions?
Anything on Slido?
I think there's a question over here.
Is there another question?
Just while you're looking, I'll just make a comment, is that actually that there was a large study or meta-analysis that looked at cover crop yields, and they had come up with 27 inches of annual rainfall was the kind of that cutoff point. So below that, you would lose yield, and then above that, then you would start gaining yield. So
Yep.
actually, if you're at 43 inches,
Yep,
then
it makes sense.
and actually, I think they found that in the higher rainfall areas that it was about a 10% yield increase. So I think that was about what you were
About where we
showing.
were, yep.
So
Makes
it was,
sense.
it was really
And
interesting.
our numbers were almost identical in a percentage basis to what they found in the UK over about a 5-year period on potatoes as well. So I don't think we were off base too much.
And are they on that same like high rainfall?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Generally, yeah.
So it's a really it was really interesting hearing that. So
And so, yeah, that differs from here, of course, but if it depends on if you're into a position where you may have more irrigation water or parts of Alberta that have more water, might be.
Okay, one more question?
I kind of have a follow-up. That 43 inches, is that all during the growing season?
No, of
Or
course
is
not,
that-
no.
Okay.
No, so,
'Cause-
there's a lot of snow in that 43 inches. But PEI, we have a very, again, sandy soil, a lot of water infiltration, and then we have a lot of water recharge because our bedrock is all like fractured sandstone. So that water goes into the soil and is available as well too. So sometimes we get too much water. We had too much water this fall, so it made problems for digging and that sort of stuff. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan. Submit before you go.